Hi, everyone, and welcome to our webinar today with the Clinician Engineer Hub, bridging the gap between clinical medicine and engineering. And I'm honored to have a very special guest here today, Saeed Fathi, who is the CEO of Avrafa. He is a visionary in the life science space and has multiple skill sets across engineering and pharmaceuticals. And essentially, I think, and Saeed, correct me if I've misunderstood, he spent several years in Cambridge, and really his true passion is bringing clinicians and engineers together, identifying any potential pain points and trying to see how the two professionals can come together with valuable solutions. And he's also someone that's very passionate about helping the next generation, supporting the next generation of innovative companies in the life sciences arena. So Saeed, thank you so much for joining us today. Pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you very much, Neil. Very pleased to be here and having this conversation. Hopefully, it will be useful.
No, absolutely. So just to start, tell us a bit about your background and focusing on why you're interested in this space.
Yeah, sure. So, yeah, I've been an engineer at heart and bioengineer by practice, and trying to do as many life science products as I can to have a wider impact. By background, I should say I'm a mechanical engineer. After my PhD, my very first job brought me to Cambridge. At the time, I was hired for an inkjet printing technology development and platform development, and that was partly what I've been doing in my PhD. Not very much related to life sciences, but coming to Cambridge and then seeing a lot of buzz around life sciences, biotech, it actually got me so much that I decided that, you know what, I've got to kind of look into life sciences and give it a lot more chance. And obviously, being in the community, I felt like, it's a good fit. So I transitioned, particularly through my very first chapter in Cambridge after inkjet industry. So I joined the company developing life science microscopy systems that gotten me to work with research groups that they were doing very innovative development work and studies, needing very highly precise systems to kind of image cells. And the very first time actually got me so much was when I was at UCL back in 2014. I think that was the very first time, in the peak of my product development in that company that I served for 6, 7 years, I took a prototype to this research group, and actually, I put down this gun and actually went inside this facility that had the behavioral studies around mice. And can you believe it? The mice was trained to be on a floating ball, the skull fixed to a setup, and we were imaging the cortex of the brain of the mouse when the mouse was walking across this virtual corridor. And that was so fascinating to see how the device that I developed, which was controlling an objective to kind of do temporal imaging of the cortex of the brain of a mouse, moving up and down, and these LED-like spots, which were brain neurons, firing up and getting green, and then we were imaging them. That was so moving, and one of the times that actually made me want to do more into life sciences was back in then. So yeah, that's how I
Yes.
actually gotten into life sciences, and then after I had a few other chapters that helped me transition and be a lot more integrated into life science sector.
No, it's very interesting. I mean, just the energy that you have is coming through. You're very passionate, very excited about what you're doing. I've got a few questions already, if I may. So you said you started off with the inkjet printers, is that correct?
Inkjet printers. In
Yeah.
Cambridge is one of the hubs in inkjet technology. And at the time I was doing when I was doing my PhD, I was working with a Cambridge-based company. And later I joined a large corporate that's Fujifilm, actually, like, and it's a global company wanting to have an engineering office in Cambridge to do inkjet systems development. And I essentially, straight after my PhD, I came to become an inkjet systems engineer. So straight away, my mindset was more about systems and systems engineering, a world which is very different to clinicians.
Yeah, no way.
And I actually like to tried over the years to kind of like, learn how to transition in that journey from a systems engineering mindset, from engineer mindset to become a clinician engineer. And that was a fascinating journey as well.
And then you said you moved into the imaging space. What lessons do you think you took from the inkjet sort of exposure to imaging? Do you think initially it sounds the two aren't related, but often for me, I think that certain skills are quite transferable.
Well, there are some, of course, like, when you're talking about inkjet systems and specifically the systems that I was developing, it had, motion control, it had thermal control, it had pneumatic control, it had fluidics control, and also it had imaging. And I was doing high speed imaging, generating these droplets, optimizing them, looking at them interfacing with surface. But this is actually taking me back like about 15 years ago. And of course, some of those sort of like, skill sets are very transferable to my very first, essentially, like, job in life sciences space, which was life science microscopy. Because I was working in piezo-based inkjet systems, I gotten a lot more interested in piezo-based devices. And piezo devices are a type of devices that they can control highly precisely. They can control motion. And motion of optics, for example, is one that is very often used in microscopy world. And so that was the sort of like, skill set transition. And of course, when you're developing an inkjet systems, which is like a big instrumentation, it's very different to a small device that you are making. And at the end of it, a researcher, for example, will be using it. But then thinking about, how I transitioned from serving researchers to clinicians later in my life, I can see that the sort of like, the transition and the gap sometimes is a lot bigger, like, understanding
Oh,
clinicians and
oh, yeah.
understanding how they are utilizing that system and how that product fits into their workflow. That was one of the biggest sort of like, gaps that I over the years bridged, and I'm very keen to be helping, as you said, newer generation to kind of like, understand that how to address this gap.
Hmm. I've been battling with the same sort of gap between the two professionals, and I think it's hopefully narrowing. Maybe quite a random question, but where do you think clinicians could potentially improve sort of in the engineering space? Do you think there's still some reluctancy to understand sort of the value of engineering, or even vice versa? How do you think engineers could benefit from, the clinical world? Because you're unique in the sense that you see it, um, and you have that advantage of both the engineering and the clinical background. But I think there's still a long way to go. What do you think we could do differently to just push the momentum in the future?
Um, I think we should appreciate the fact that the mindsets are different. I think the mindset of an engineer is to kind of like, offer solution. They are great at building things, right? Whereas clinicians are great at like, identifying the problem, understanding the needs. And so that gap is very important for an engineer who wants to serve clinicians to understand. So from clinicians' point of view, they shouldn't also assume that they need to articulate solution to engineers. They should articulate their problem, their pain point. and their insight is essentially a gold dust for an engineer to utilize to be able to kind of like, develop a solution that is possible to scale and to be adopted in an ecosystem. So my advice to engineers who want to transition into the world of life sciences is that always welcome very much. Go and find a clinician who's helping, who's happy to help you to sort of like, see them in sort of like, as close as possible to action, follow them in the sort of like, their workflow. Interview them in a way that you want to understand. It's like you are becoming part of the workflow before you jump onto developing any solution. And likewise to the clinicians, you know, in terms of like, articulating the need, the pain points, the workflows, and giving the opportunity to engineers to kind of like, being exposed to those scenarios. That's amazing. And I have some examples of that in lately in fertility specifically. I've been very close to many clinicians. I'm also in the other side, working with another field in cell therapy that we can dive deeper into. But always having another opportunity to be understanding the other party and bridging that gap is amazing. And that will be great to appreciate the fact that you really need to have that clinician mindset at the very, very beginning of the product development. It shouldn't be seen that a clinician should test a product or a solution. No,
Totally right. Yeah.
part of the design process. They should be very much in the very beginning, at the very beginning of the journey.
No, I fully agree. And I think where we've gone wrong in the past is they come in slightly too late, and then we tend to realize that the product doesn't gain traction. I like your analysis very much, and you're clearly very experienced already, which is great viewing.
I'm
Um,
still learning. Obviously, with every
yes,
product, there is a great, one of the biggest joy of product development and being able to serve multiple projects is the fact that there is a lot to learn. And not only learning about these great and amazing clinician people that are going to be at the very end, like you use of it, but also trying to connect the dots and making sure that you create a chapter that someday you take the sort of like a joy of telling the story about the product and things that has gone wrong in the beginning and things that actually gone very well eventually. And that the storytelling is, I think, is moving to many innovators and entrepreneurs that are, they are sacrificing their life essentially, like, best days of their life to kind of go and take the risk of developing solutions that someday may be used to save people's life.
no, fascinating. I think, product development is something that clinicians definitely have very little exposure to. I think one of the initial steps probably is to get clinicians and engineers together from the start. What are the two pieces of advice would you say in product development generally you could potentially offer teams and groups that come together if they're trying to push a product to market? What are the
Mm,
two things maybe that, I mean, I know there's multiple things, but if you
yeah,
were to
yeah.
pick two more things, what would you say we need to be mindful of?
So I would say, two other things if I want to say is, understanding that business model, understanding, how that product or activity is going to be paid, the reimbursement, the stakeholders behind decision making for generating sort of like, that momentum for the product to be adopted and scaled. Because end of the day, it may have a great technology in it, and it may actually address a pain point, but it may be too niche, for example, and it may not be scalable. I mean, scalability is another one. I mean, it's a very important topic for an engineer and a clinician to understand that somebody's got to invest into that solution. There is a lot of time and effort it takes to kind of get a product to market, and those stakeholders, these being like, angel investors, these being like, VCs, these being partners, these being adopters that they later adopt a sort of like, product and offer it at a scale, like larger companies and corporates, for example, you got to understand how that works. And so that's one area I welcome very much engineers and clinicians to kind of think about when they are meeting to kind of like, generate an innovating product to market. And also, going back to the basics again, rather than jumping in the solution, having a very clear articulation of the requirements. Requirements is very, very important at the very beginning to be very well documented and interrogated. You have this user requirements that you have to translate into technical requirements. The user requirements requires a customer champion. That clinician, for example, can be a customer champion. You always have to have one of those people in the team to be able to properly document the needs before you actually jump into solution. And of course, in the gap between the sort of offering solution, I know that a lot of engineers are very creative and they want to kind of create these ideas. But before doing so, one should really think hard about these requirements to be properly documented in translating the product requirements to technical requirements. And in that technical requirements, then you then obviously are able to develop these solutions that that very, very sort of like, hardly should be interrogated when it comes to risks. Because, when we are talking about the sort of like product development journey, I'm essentially describing the steps. Again, to the point of going back to the basics. These are now very much the basic workflow that you require until you have that matrix of requirements, product requirements translated into technical requirements. From technical requirements, you obviously engineers can work around the offering solutions, but then interrogating those solutions against requirements to identify risks areas, and then how to best mitigate those risks is very much the very basics of product development that an engineer who wants to kind of join into this journey should consider. Obviously these are the basics of ISO 13485 when it comes to medical devices, and there are, of course, like, not only ISO standard available for them to read and learn about it. I'm talking about engineers who haven't done it before and they want to transition into it. And then, of course, there are a lot of materials to kind of like, go through and be properly trained on those topics before sort of like, wanting to take on a chapter in their career as a clinician engineer.
Yeah, no, I think documentation is crucial. We learn this as clinicians, certainly from the start. Document everything, or it's not been done.
Yes.
And I guess certainly in the product space, like you say, with devices and diagnostics, that the same holds true.
That's right. And I used to work for a big corporate called GE Healthcare, and later they part of that company, which was I was working in cell and gene therapy, became and in life sciences section of it became Cytiva. And obviously we had a quality management system based on ISO 13485 and a lot of documentation. People think that, okay, well, you developed a product, it's been tested, it actually shows the results is there, and that's it. No, when it comes to like, medical devices, there is a huge amount of documentation, and it's not a cup of tea for everyone, but there is a lot of joy, to be honest, when it comes to properly documenting the whole process, not only from technical, file point of view, but also from the point of view that you don't leave risks behind. And Neil, I'm telling you, when it comes to product development, one of the points that engineers, I think a lot of them were very well aware of that, and also stakeholders should be very much aware of, is the fact that the cost of change is huge later down the line when the product is getting a scale. Early days, you can mess it up. You can essentially have, iterate several times, make sure that you design something robust. But then when it comes to scale, if you leave risks behind, that is going to be having a huge cost, not only from the perspective of the literal money from cost point of view, but also credibility point of view and the project timeline point of view. So risk, taking deeper look into the risk and why we need documentation, develop and appreciate an understanding of why documentation is needed for the fact that there may be some risk around the corner that you have missed or overlooked that needs to be addressed, and that may result a change that later in the journey of product development, it may become very costly. So that's why we need a lot of documentation.
Very valuable advice. Yeah, I think sometimes we get excited on the solution, and we don't realize all the steps that are involved. I wanted to also ask actually, so one of the things that I think clinicians may not be so clued up in is around the finances. I guess we can blame medical school. They don't teach us this. They teach us the anatomy and the physiology. But obviously, for any product to get to where it needs to be, there needs to be adequate finances for the team and sufficient resources. So you mentioned about angel investors, VCs. I guess it's a topic in itself, but do you have any particular preference, or do you think it's relevant to what the particular product is? Or do you think avoiding that path may be better and fundraising in a different way? Talking as someone
Right.
with no experience. So
Sure. I mean, I should say that yes, in the past 2.5 years, I mean, I personally been I'm relatively new to the world of fundraising, I should say. In my last 9 to 5 job, which never been a 9 to 5, it was a lot longer than that. I was in a position to build teams in the UK, in the US, grown the team as part of that company, which transitioned from Series A to Series B, and we raised nearly $60 million in the way. Obviously, my exposure to that that was my very first exposure to investors who came in to do the due diligence, and I really liked that an engagement. It helped me to kind of think a little bit deeper about how to put together team in earlier years to kind of get ready to that phase of large money that is needed for certain products to get to market. But when it comes to earlier stage, yeah, last 2.5 years, I've been essentially taken my journey of product development to a stage of, I said to myself, okay, I done enough of product development for others. Maybe I can essentially identify these visionary life sciences that I can help them at the very beginning, because I quite often I see that a lot of these visionary life scientists, they have great ideas, they have great technology, but they don't know how to scale it, how to transition it to a sellable, scalable, manufacturable product. So that's why I decided to come and join in very early stage and bridge that gap essentially. So my advice to these founders who are in the pursuit of funding their ideas is the fact that you got to understand how an investor mind works. Obviously it's all about risks. They're putting down their capital. Either this is a a bigger funds that they have, people's pension in it, and therefore they have to kind of do their best in terms of identifying these great ideas that can make it through. Or when it comes to angel investors, of course, they have a mindset of making sure that they take a risk, that there are some good rewards, behind that. Some of these investments can be impact investment, and therefore certain areas that founders work that can have high impact, of course, they can get funded. So obviously, as the idea is very early stage, it does require a small funds, from more of an angel type investors who come in and they can take on the risk. And then later down the line, it's going to be these more established VCs. Obviously, there is a lot of information and insight available for founders to go for. But what I often see, and I am very keen for founders to appreciate perhaps more, especially like younger and less experienced founders, is that sometimes your customers can be great investors in your product. You share your vision, you have something that can potentially be in a stage of demonstration and working, and get them excited about what you're doing. And these sort of customers, for example, in the clinical world, could be doctors. I give you an example of that, of a company at the moment, which I am fractional leader in the company, and I invested through my company Avrafa in that company. That's an Australian company who's in the field of fertility, and taking the idea to the hands of these clinics. Obviously, I did play a role in doing so, especially coming out of Australia, and we managed to kind of get these doctors that they have seen firsthand how this AI-based microscopy platform is helping their team, the embryologists, the clinicians, to kind of like, identify the, in this case, it's a sperm detection technology using vision AI. And, the product is addressing a great pain, but the fact is that it's been very much manual process for for many years, and now this company is trying to kind of offer a companion, a tool to the sort of like clinicians to be able to accelerate the process. And firsthand, these doctors are seeing how much value this is bringing, not only from the perspective of like time saving, but also from the perspective of very sort of like challenging cases of men patients who have to go through surgeries. At that point, they are desperate to have to find one sperm or two sperm. So when it comes to these products, showing that they are promising products, that they can help these couples to kind of like get their to their dream of having a child, then obviously that's very moving to those doctors, and they become an investor, potentially for that product. And that's how this company is trying to close around now, that using that exposure, going early days to these clinicians and showing the product, and showing the promise it's bringing, and of course backed up by clinical studies and the rest of it behind it. It's an opportunity for the customer to be your investor. So despite what people think, that there's angels, there are like VCs and the rest of it, sometimes founders have an opportunity to go and get the customers becoming their investors. So that's one of the areas I'd like to share
No,
with
that's a
the
really good
audience.
example. I think, yeah, no, you've touched upon some fantastic things, particularly around, the product development space. Just to briefly summarize, you mentioned that clinicians and engineers should come together right from the start, because that helps to identify the right solution. You also mentioned documentation is everything. I think that seems like a pain point, in fact, but clinicians should be used to that. I'm not sure about the engineers, but let's see. And the various aspects around, financing, discussing, benefits from sort of the angel side to the venture capitalist. Any final thoughts from your side in product development?
Well, I should say that, as I mentioned earlier, the world of product development is very rewarding. Seeing that product, coming out from just an idea all the way through, sort of like, to its maturity, and getting to the hands of end users, having an impact on patients, and then having investors seeing the value of it, and helping that product get to market, and have widen that impact to so many people. That's very rewarding journey. So I personally really enjoyed that. Of course, the industry goes up and down. There are like in periods of time that you can see healthcare, biotech, life sciences. They are very much a center of attention. For example, when we had the COVID age, but we know that health is one of the biggest areas of development and human prosperity in the coming years when it comes to technology development. So if you're passionate about having that joy of seeing your product impacting people's life, that's the life sciences and health tech and med tech is an area that you should certainly consider. Hopefully we see more and more of this joint effort between clinician approaching engineers and engineers like going after clinicians. And events like earlier this week, for example, Neil, the two of us were there talking to oncology teams, very high profile oncology key opinion leaders about the product that I'm working on cell therapy manufacturing, development manufacturing platform. Seeing opportunities like that, that's very, very rewarding. And I very much welcome for people in the position of influence, especially in the health side of it, in the sort of like healthcare sort of like outset, like hospitals and university research groups, that I very much welcome opportunities like these to welcome engineers in. And the team around Cambridge are doing a great job actually to do that. And I think there is an opportunity for many other areas in the UK and around to kind of like adopt this type of model to bring engineers and clinicians together.
No, I agree, and I think here at Addenbrooke's we're certainly working very hard to keep pushing this concept through. It's still early days, but it's happening, and let's see what happens over the next year or so.
No,
Saeed,
amazing job, Neil. It's great, and I really appreciate what you are doing, and happy to kind of like be part of this sort of like support ecosystem and share my experience. And we encourage more of engagements between the clinicians and engineers in the area. So hopefully we see more people who are listening to our conversation wanting to join the effort.
no, 100%. Thank you so much, Saeed. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
All
Thank
right.
you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.